the goal today is for me to share with you initially some fundamental ideas about what is esotericism, what is the perennial philosophy. I think in this module I just would like to lay out a little broad understanding of its history, what it represents, and also what are some of the branches of it, because there's many facets to this view of life. And I think I want to first say that the perennial philosophy has other names, and so it would be well for you to know them. It's been called the esoteric philosophy, which is actually what I more often refer to it as. It's also been called the ageless wisdom, And it's interesting because there's some of the origins of it are somewhat lost in the mist of time. It is believed to possibly be the oldest philosophy out there, in a certain sense. And it should be noted that it is just that, a philosophy. It is not a theology. The esoteric philosophy doesn't try to put forth any kind of moral code. It's not trying to say do this and don't do that. Really, it's a collection of very profound, fascinating ideas and it invites us all to just look at those ideas and feel how they feel in terms of our relationship to our journey, as well as the relationship we have to the greater life, which could be called God. So there's no sense of do this or don't do that. Now the history of it is, when we look at recorded history, we can certainly see it in some of the ancient writings of India, in the Upanishads, for instance. And we see elements of it, in Chaldean thinking, ancient Egyptian thinking. We see evidence of it in the root of all world religions. There's some connecting points, which is one of the reasons I love this philosophy, is because in a way, it has an underpin. It underpins all philosophies in a certain sense, and it holds the idea that, in a certain sense, when I look at religion, we would say this, that no religion has found the truth, but every religion has found a piece of it. That's kind of a core concept here, and that. What I do is I try to present the philosophy in a way that is graspable to people of modern day society, because it is a deep philosophy, and when you read it and look at it, I mean, you read Alice Bailey, as Don had mentioned earlier, sometimes it's a bit intimidating. So my job is to try to translate it for you. But it's actually older than that. We know, for instance, that the mythology is that it goes back to ancient Atlantis. That's the ancient mythology associated with it. But we know that in Western thought, we know that in Greek thinking, it was clearly evident. If you really look at people like Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle, Socrates, these were great initiates in the esoteric philosophy. Now, if you were to speak with them and say, hey, Plato, were you an esoteric philosopher? He'd go, huh? What are you talking about? How we know that is not by any kind of thing they define themselves as. Actually, it's just because of the way they thought, the way they patterned their perception, the way they looked at things, and the deeper principles they were trying to advocate. And the general understanding of this philosophy is that not only does it give birth to, you might say, or seed or initiate new impulse within religion, but all other systems as well. There's a lot of correlation between esotericism and politics. It's connected to economics. It's connected to the arts. It's connected to science. And in fact, in this philosophy, all of those branches are viewed as just categories of human consciousness evolving over the vastness of time. And each is trying to struggle to lift itself to a higher way, a higher expression, and in many ways is struggling to transform its lower nature in order to do that. Just like a human being, it's viewed that you and I are a soul, but we're working through an outer instrument called a personality, and that personality has distorting elements to it. And in many ways, the spiritual path has a lot to do with transforming the lower so that it becomes a rightful servant to the higher. And in a way, that same idea is seen in this philosophy in the broader sense, that we can say that regarding social institutions, whether it's science, the arts, etc. And the idea here is that the esoteric philosophy presents itself and launches trends of thought. And then what happens is, over time, society becomes more and more, the ideas become more integrated in society, and in many cases, let us say religion, many of the ideas are integrated into theology, but as theology moves forward, there's a lot of evidence that it increasingly becomes more dogmatic and more rigid, and it begins to actually kind of turn against the mystical root that gave it birth. And that turning against the mystical root forces the philosophy underground. It goes underground for centuries. And then it rises again when the time is right, when there's a set of circumstances that suggest that bringing it forward again and sounding its note is time. And so history is filled with this sort of coming and going of this philosophy. And many tangential branches have emerged over the centuries in relationship to this. So things like Masonry. The core of Masonry is very esoteric, although Masonry has become very crystallized and rigid as well. But also the anthroposophy, theosophy, the Rosicrucian movement. All of these are strongly connected to the esoteric philosophy. They're just simply branches that come forth from it. And we're told that this philosophy has been reintroduced in a very big way in the late 1800s as a kind of preparation for a great transition that humanity's believed to be going through. A transition from an astrological perspective, a kind of a Piscean era to an Aquarian era, and that humanity itself is approaching a great transitional opportunity, it is believed, and that crisis is always understood as a prelude to great transitional change. And that holds true with you and I, and that also holds true with social institutions, and that also is believed to hold true with humanity as a whole. So it's a philosophy that is reintroducing itself, and we are given to understand that there are 3 phases to the reintroduction of it. And the first phase was the work of Helena Blavatsky, the Russian mystic, back in the 1800s, who wrote what is called the Secret Doctrine and launched the Theosophical movement. And today the Theosophical Society is you might say, the remnant of that movement. Then the second phase is believed to have been brought forward through the work of Alice A. Bailey, who Don had mentioned earlier. And a lot of my background is with that particular phase of it. And it's got many branches to it that I'll share with you in a minute. And then there's a third phase that is not yet here. And it was long predicted that the third phase will be brought forward sometime around the year 2025. It's believed that the next phase and the final phase will come forward, and that it's with the 3 combined that we have the larger picture of what is said to inaugurate the new and dawning age for humanity. And we only have 2/3 of it. 2/3 of it. We speculate as to what that third phase may look like, but we don't have it. So we do the best we can with what we have. Okay. Now, in this philosophy, there are several branches to it. There is a whole cosmology system. So huge question marks about how to understand cosmos itself, how to understand what is creation, what is God, and I think some of that might be addressed in the questions that these 2 are going to be asking me a little later. I have a feeling. And but there's an astrological branch to it. Esoteric astrology, which is quite different than astrology as understood in the mainstream, is part of it. There's a whole branch called esoteric psychology, which is really an interesting branch, and it's very much a division of it that I put a lot of attention in, because it has a lot to do with the whole subject of the evolution of human consciousness. What is consciousness? What is soul? These are, and how does the soul want to transform the personality? And how might the personality make it difficult to do that? And what can be done about it? And it's a vast subject, and it's fascinating. It even breaks down this understanding that there are 7 fundamental types of souls in humanity, and that each type will want to bring an uplifting contribution to human betterment, but in entirely different ways, through different streams, and often through different social institutions. So if possible, we may touch on some of that today too, depending upon where this all goes. But it's a fascinating inquiry. That's esoteric psychology. Okay? There's also a whole branch on healing and how this philosophy understands spiritual healing. And then there's another branch that has to do with creativity. In other words, it's sometimes called the art of magic, which is just really saying, how does the soul in each of us, how does it want to creatively launch progressive ideations within our minds? How do we then take those new ideas and bring them out into the outer world, and do it with a sense of wisdom in terms of how that works? How do we learn to use the personality as an instrument, and recognize that that's the destiny of the personality, is to be the creative agent on behalf of the soul's creative agenda? And how does that work? And there's a fascinating understanding of the steps needed for the soul to inspire our thoughts, to bring emotion into it, and how to understand right timing when you want to bring the best of you forward into the world and to make that contribution. You know, it is said that the soul in each of us is governed by several laws. And one of them, the third law, is called the law of service. That every human soul wants to express through the personality. It wants to do that without the personality getting in the way. And by the way, that's where the challenge is, just to let you know. And in so doing, it wants to make an uplifting contribution to something beyond itself. And and it doesn't matter if that person calls himself a Christian, a Buddhist, a Hindu practitioner, an atheist. It doesn't matter. It's really a story of the divinity within you seeking to find opportunity to work in the outer world to make a difference. So esoteric psychology and the creative process are big parts of this philosophy, and it's a lot of where my work tends to center. And then it's also very related to the times we're living in, because the esoteric philosophy would say that, as I mentioned, humanity is on the brink of a tremendous transformational opportunity, potentially even this century, and that much of the world crisis that we see today, much of it is actually anticipated, because, as I said earlier, from a certain perspective, and I'd be happy to share with you why this is, but from a certain perspective, the human evolution, the evolution of human consciousness has a lot to do with sort of stepping into times or crisis periods, but crisis as a forerunner to a new and dawning state of consciousness. It's sort of like chaos leading to a higher harmony, a higher unity, a higher organization, to use more scientific terminology for it. And that this philosophy would also say that all of humanity on a higher level is one entity. And maybe I should define something for you first here, because I think if there's one principle of the many principles in this philosophy that I think would be well for you to know, It's the principle of hylozoism. I don't know if you've heard that term before. It's kind of a strange word, isn't it?
Spell that.
Sure. So it's spelled H-Y-L-O-Z, or Z, I guess you say, ism, hylozoism. And it's an amazingly important concept to get a grasp on, because with it, other things in this philosophy will come together much easier for you. So let me define it. And to start, let me just say that this philosophy believes that in the ultimate sense, there's only one thing, one living presence, one beingness. Some people call it God, others call it Brahma, others call it universal intelligence. Call it what you like. In this philosophy, it's often called the one life, the one life. And that one life manifests itself in and as cosmos, the one becoming the many. And in a certain sense, there is, in some of the Western theological views, there's a kind of attitude that there's a God out there, and then there's this creation and a gulf that we want to reconcile with. But the esoteric philosophy would say that it's not God and creation, but God as creation. And the God as creation notion is a whole different framing. It changes the very fabric of how we see ourselves in relationship to this thing we call God or the divine. In the one sense, when there's a gulf, there's a sense of being in a kind of separate position. Whereas in this philosophy, it would say that in the truest, ultimate sense, you are the divinity you seek, because you are a ray from the one. And that much of the challenge we have is just that our consciousness is only struggling to evolve itself to a point where we can begin to sense that in fact is true, you see. So I don't know, do you know who Joseph Campbell was? Yeah. Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist. He once said this, he referred to Western theologies, he said that they were essentially theologies of exile. Theologies of exile. Even the biblical story of the Garden of Eden was a story of exile, but a kind of sense being cast away from God. And yet esotericism would say that that's an illusion, that it's actually not exile at all. You are that divinity, but it's about coming to a state of consciousness to discover that. So back to the hylozoism for the definition, and that is this. There's kind of two parts to this term. The first is this, is that if it is true that there's only one living presence and it's manifesting in and as cosmos, then there really can be no true inorganic anything. Because if there's only one life manifesting in and as cosmos, then how could anything in creation escape the embrace of that one life? How could it? Even the atoms in this chair are believed to be teeming with life if we could but understand it. But we have a very narrow definition of what life is. Science has a very narrow definition of life. And and I can't tell you all of the factors to it, but a few common factors are life must be able to consume resources, it must expel waste, it must reproduce. These are how science kind of uses as views. But from an esoteric point of view, that's incredibly arbitrary. And that if this philosophy is correct in that sense, then it's all one thing manifesting at different levels of consciousness, you see. So that's definition number one. But definition number two is actually the piece of it that I really think is most important here. And that is that it is believed that every unit of life is nested within a larger life. Every unit of life is a cell within a vaster beingness. So I like to when I usually talk about this, I like to use a simple way of looking at it. If I take a cell in my hand, From an esoteric point of view, that cell is a unit of consciousness. It has a spark of consciousness in it, life itself. Infinitesimal, no question. You know, and if you think about it, I don't know if you've ever studied cellular biology, but it's not hard to imagine that a cell is an entity, really. It's amazing, really. But nonetheless, it's just a cell within a larger living system that is me and you. And you and I are viewed as cells within a larger being as well. And that being is called humanity. And that from an esoteric point of view, the whole of the human family, the sum total of all humanity, is one being. And it has a soul. And it has a personality. And indeed, it's believed that right now, at this time in human history, the soul of humanity is trying to have a greater infusing effect on the personality of humanity. And many of the problems that we see globally around the world that are so devastating represent the crisis that arises through that process. And we can certainly talk more about that if you like. But to continue with Hylozoism, it's viewed that humanity, though an entity in its own right, is a unit of consciousness within a vaster entity. And that entity we call the planetary logos, the entity that ensouls the whole planet, and that you and I are cells of existence within it. And that entity is like a god to us, and that entity is incarnating, and that all the kingdoms of nature, mineral, plant, animal, human, and even subtler kingdoms, are simply layers of its consciousness evolving through form. And in fact, if you know anything about Eastern philosophy, I don't know, are you folks familiar with the chakras idea, the 7 chakras? In esotericism, it's understood that the whole of humanity, the totality of humanity, is said to represent the throat chakra to that entity. The throat chakra. Imagine that for just a moment. The sum total of all human consciousness is this vibration. Wow. And of course, when I think about that, it begs the question, what's the function of a throat chakra? Because to understand that is to have some sense of what it means to really be human from a spiritual perspective. And the throat chakra is the great chakra of spiritual ideation. It's through the activation of this chakra and the enlivening of it that the higher part of you can find expression and creative effects in the world can be launched as a result of your soul's interaction with this chakra. So what does that mean? It means humanity, in the big picture, is understood as the creative outlet for the planetary logos' intention. It's a huge responsibility. But it too is just a unit within a larger entity called the solar logos. The solar logos is believed to be the entity that ensouls the entire solar system, and that planets are chakras within it. And it goes further. I think that it is just a couple. I'll give you 2 more steps on it, but you get the idea. The next step is called that it is believed that our solar system, which is a god to us, which is one of the great gifts of ancient religions that spoke of sun worship. When those religions that spoke of sun worship, they were onto something. They were onto something. I mean, if there's one thing in the sky that if you want to use one thing to represent God, I think the sun is a fairly good candidate, wouldn't you think? Mm-hmm. But that's relative too, because then it's understood that our solar system as an entity is a chakra within a vaster entity of 7, the local group it's called, of 7 stars, of which ours is one. And it is believed that our star, our solar logos, is the heart chakra in that entity. So when people say God is love, when we talk about it from that perspective, they're onto something too. Our particular local God, you might say, is an agency of cosmic love. And so all of that must precipitate down all the way through. But I'll take you one more step. Let's jump up about 30 steps and go all the way up to a galaxy. The entire Milky Way galaxy The entire Milky Way galaxy is also believed to be an entity. Science now tells us that the Milky Way galaxy has 150 billion stars. Billion stars. That's 150 billion solar loci. And that in its totality, it's spiral shaped, it's called a galactic logos. And then to top it off, we now know that there are millions of galaxies.
Wow.
So yes, billions of galaxies. So I always kind of jokingly say this, sometimes I in my work, I find people that are, maybe they're just starting to learn to meditate. Maybe they're part of, let's say, the New Age movement or something. And they have a meditation experience and they said, I reached total cosmic consciousness. And, when I see that, I just sort of, in my mind, laugh and I say to myself, or recommend that just turn and run when you see that. Turn and run. Not even the solar logos could make that claim. Sometimes when we evolve our consciousness, it's understood that when you first start to wake up and you have these inner expansions of consciousness, the lower self confuses moreness and allness. What you're experiencing is moreness, but it's thought to be allness. But eventually there's further refinement in consciousness through meditation and self-development, and you start to realize the incremental nature of this. But it's quite common. So that's hylozoism, you see, and therefore even God is considered in a way a relative term. So you can see it's a very big philosophy. If I go back to the question of the 7 types of souls that are so central to an understanding of this philosophy, each of them has a great gift. We call it the 7 rays. Maybe, are you familiar with that? It's the 7 rays? Okay, well, a way to look at that is that imagine that, let's use God as let's say that God is white light. And let's say that white light is projected through a prism. Well, that white light will divide itself into 7 colors of the visible spectrum. By analogy, that is how it's viewed. That the greater life, as it incarnates itself, it divides itself into 7 qualities. They're equal, but they're different. And these 7 qualities are called the 7 rays. And what's most important from a human being's perspective is to understand that it is believed that your soul is on one of those rays. And to know your soul ray is to know the very purpose of your being. And the nature of service that is likely to come forth as you evolve your consciousness to become more and more of that soul. And the great challenge is that each of us, we are, well, look at these soul rays as a type of, see it as a lens. See it as a lens of your higher consciousness. And they're each 7 lenses, let's say. And they're lenses that life looks out at the world. And it sees through that lens. And each lens organizes perception differently. Each lens not only organizes perception, but also is inclined to be attracted to certain ways of being in the world versus others. Certain modes of surface versus others. And that it's not just a lens that's looking out, but it's also action and reaction is largely defined by that lens. And so there are some soul types that are attracted to the department of education and the healing arts. Others are more likely to be moving to serve humanity through the arts. Others science, others government or leadership or anything that inclines toward executive tendency. Other types of souls want to make their uplifting contribution through theology. In fact, each of these ray types, you might say, are animating, they animate social systems as well. So it's not just human beings that are on a ray type and therefore inclined to live a certain spiritual way, but massive social institutions underpinned by these patterns of consciousness. So, for instance, religion is said to be part of the sixth ray stream, the sixth ray. We would call it we would say this, the department of religion. The department of religion is governed by the sixth ray, which is also called the ray of idealism and devotion. Idealism and devotion. And that it doesn't matter which religion it is. If you look at world religions, all of them at their core have some strong note of devotion, and it could be a devotion to a text, devotion to a teacher, like a Jesus or a Buddha, and also a strong set of idealistic precepts that underpin it. And that stream is incredibly important in support of the evolution of the greater life, but not the only one. And that the second-ray stream, for instance, people that are second-ray souls are more inclined to serve humanity through the Department of Education or the healing arts or many of the helping professions. That's as spiritual. Or the fifth-ray soul. The fifth ray is called the ray of concrete knowledge and science. People, some of the most advanced people on the planet come from the fifth ray stream. And they're committing their lives. They see through the lens of science, that patterning of consciousness, and they understand through that lens how to clarify truth and how to help humanity through scientific inquiry. And that's as spiritual as the Department of Religion, and as spiritual as the Department of Education. There's another ray type called the third ray type. It's called active intelligence and adaptability. And today, in today's society, it largely underpins the world of economics and business. And its mandate, in the big picture, its mandate is to facilitate right distribution of resources in order to ensure the sustenance of all life on this planet. And there's no area of humanity more adept at resource generation and distribution. True it is that there's a lot of hoarding going on, a huge amount of it, but that's just the lower tendency of that great category of consciousness. See, each of these, think of these institutions as being entities in their own right, and they have a higher nature and a lower nature, including religion. In many ways, what I understand about Cana is that many of you, as if I understand it correctly, you're trying to kind of reach beyond the locked-in traditional perspective to see perhaps we would say that you're trying to break yourself free from the limits of the personality expression of the theology. But the soul of the theology is sacred and eternal, but the personality often becomes rigid. I have a saying that I use in a lot of places. I often say that, that which is your temple today will become your prison tomorrow. The beliefs we hold as near and dear, as long as they feed us and help us grow, whether it's in religion or science or the arts, whatever it is, but let's say religion, as long as it enriches us and expands us and gives us new meaning to life, and fantastic. But every set of thought forms reaches their breaking point of they have a limit to what they can give us. And when we reach that limit in our development, then we start doing what I think Cana is trying to do, is to break free, because it starts to become a prison. And we see it all through society today. We see it in politics, we see it in science and the arts, and the irony is that when a social system that's governed by one of these great streams of ray streams, when it or the people within it reach the point where it now becomes a prison, the great irony is that not only do you become a prisoner, but in a kind of ironic way, we become both the warden and the guard. You know what I mean? It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing thing. So a lot of the work for us individually and a social institution like religion collectively is to start to discern the difference between the higher nature of that institution and its lower nature. You know, even in the world of, you know, I can't tell you how many times I've seen people in different countries, they look at the world situation today and they see the economic crisis and they say to themselves, the problems of the world today are those businessmen. I mean, business is the problem. Get rid of business. And I think to myself, wait a minute, the problems of the world aren't business. Many of the problems of the world relate to the lower tendencies of that stream, but what about the soul of business? What about the soul of religion? What about the soul of education? Those are eternally and absolutely essential within a living social evolution. So there's quite a bit of emphasis here in this philosophy of starting to discern things out there and the duality of things. What is the form and what is the essence that is struggling to find expression through that form, and to what extent does that form distort that essence or bring it forth with greater purity or clarity, you see? Just like you and I. My soul is trying to work through a personality. I have distortions in my personality. I'm imperfect. And those distortions will have a tendency at some level to have a potential distorting effect on the higher me trying to express through the lower me. And I don't think I'm alone with that. I might be wrong. I might be wrong, but I don't think I'm alone with that. You know,
Don's running a whole wisdom school that'll help you find out.
Okay, great. Okay, good. Yeah, so, and just as a side note, one of the things to keep in mind is that idea of sensing the deeper thing beyond the form, that's a function of the third eye. The third eye, which is so emphasized in Indian thinking, you know. How does that, there's a biblical verse like that too. What is it? When thy eye is single.
You know.
I don't know the exact wording, but there's something about the importance of single eye. The single eye. Yeah. And this third eye is actually, there's a whole understanding of the idea that eye, that inner way of looking, that the more the soul has transformed the personality, the wider that eye gets. So if you're on the path in a very conscious way, we all have squinting third eyes. But I always think that's better than none at all, okay? And enlightenment, which is now is a big subject, but enlightenment is when that third eye is now fully open. So you know, it is said that the third eye is the eye that helps you sense the soul hidden in all things. The soul hidden in all things. When you look at, and I'll just be brief here because I'm running out of the time frame here, but when you look at a tree, for instance, if you look at a beautiful tree, these two eyes, which are sometimes called the eyes that look from here to there, these two eyes see the characteristics of the tree. But when your third eye is beginning to open, which requires that you learn to look at things with soft eyes, then you start to sense something beyond the form called tree. You sense some livingness in the tree. You sense a kind of life force working its way through the trunk, the branches and the leaves. You're sensing much more of the living soulfulness of that tree. Now when we look in nature, when we go in nature, I mean, nature is nearly perfect. So nature is this wonderful place to just make that happen for you. But it's also true in other places. Like, for instance, you see it in other people. If you look the right way, you sense a soulfulness beyond their personality, even beyond some of their personality quirks that you might find rather despicable. You know? Or how about social systems? If you watch the BBC, and you see what's playing out in the Middle East, On the one level, you can look at that and the BBC presents you the form. Yes, the BBC may have its biases, because they're imperfect people as well, but they have their biases. But nonetheless, you're being presented the form. But when you look at that, can you sense beyond the form? Can you sense what are the deeper qualities of consciousness that are struggling to express themselves through the circumstances in the Middle East and are doing it with various degrees of distortion and pain? And you start to see a duality there. It's not just things, it's social events. It's seeing, it's another way of looking at, sometimes I think about it that, you know that old expression, looking behind the scenes? Well, this is another way of looking at it in a deeper spiritual way. What's behind the scene? What's behind the thing that is presenting itself? And one of the ways to realize that we're all much more able to start to sense that when we look at the world, if we are willing to, for a while, suspend judgment. Because it is said that rapid judgment closes the third eye. Closes the third eye. Closes the third eye.
Wow.
Anyway, I could go on and on. But I hope that gives you at least an introductory feel of what this philosophy is really about. So,
Thank you.
welcome.
Thank you.
My pleasure. My pleasure.